They found that native peoples all over the world were actually doing this. Well, it's not confined to the Amazon. It was just originally discovered there. But native peoples all around the world were using charcoal to intentionally improve soil. And it's also true that it's a natural part of all of our soils all around the world. Anywhere where there's fire in the ecosystem, there is black carbon in the soil, and it dramatically improves soil quality, soil health, productivity, right? It's a part of all the soils all over the world.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to Earthlings 2.0, the show where we imagine how we could be better versions of ourselves and build a collective future we actually want to live in. Today, we're diving into how a deceptively simple material could help regenerate soils, improve crop yields, and sequester carbon for centuries. No matter which way the political winds might blow, the need for carbon removal is not a hypothetical. Over 97% of scientists authoring over 12,000 scientific papers are in agreement. We have to do something. And biochar is an emerging tool that is both low tech and can be a more credible carbon market removal solution than others that have come along. In fact, this year, Microsoft and Google both announced that they are the world's largest biochar removal deals. So, Microsoft's deal aims to remove 1.24 million tons of carbon dioxide for the tech company over 10 years, and that dwarfs Google's previous announcement of purchasing carbon credits that would account for removing 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide using biochar. And I love that even in their ESG work, these big tech companies are always trying to one up each other. Keep it up, tech bros, because to me, this signals a major shift in how the technology is valued. But before we bring on our guest to break this all down for us, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I'm the CEO of the award-winning PR firm Technica Communications and the founder of Women in Clean Tech and Sustainability. Before building those organizations, I was an environmental health, science, and tech reporter for NPR and PBS. And whether this is your first or 50th episode, thank you so much for joining us today. We love bringing you these stories. It's our creative outlet in a weird way. And if you're a writer, you would get that. And I really am thrilled that you all are enjoying these episodes and you keep coming back week after week. And if you're brand new, welcome. Have a look around. We have a couple of other interesting interviews that are related to this topic of agriculture and carbon removal. And we'll link some of those in the show notes. And if you want to contribute to our community, the best way to do that is to share this show with a friend of yours. The next time you talk at podcasts or YouTube shows, or maybe you cite some information that you heard on the podcast, feel free to let people know where you heard it. And in fact, you can even send them a text of the show. And that way they've got that in the palm of their hand and they can remember to listen to it later. This is the best way to help us grow our community and to be an active participant in it. If you've done that, thank you so much. It's working. And please continue to do it. You can also join our Substack newsletter. You can also subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app, or if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and put a like and a subscription into the feed there so that we can bring you more stories and more people can learn about the stories that you like. And thank you to Resource Labs for having us on the network. Even as the voluntary carbon market grows, trust, scalability, and impact still remain front and center and often a challenge for the industry. Rigorous monitoring and verification is still needed to ensure that this carbon stays locked away. Standardized metrics need to capture a lot of these co-benefits, such as healthier soil and cleaner water. And farmers, cities, and industries need solutions that can integrate seamlessly without adding too much cost or complexity. So these are big challenges and also enormous opportunities for biochar to prove itself both as a practical and scalable tool. That's where the U.S. Biochar Initiative comes in. USBI is a not for profit company looking to accelerate the production and use of biochar across agriculture, industry, and infrastructure. And today's guest is Myles Gray. He's the executive director of USBI, and he first discovered biochar back in 2007 when a mentor showed him how it could be used to purify drinking water in Honduras. That conversation sparked a 15-year career at the intersection of science, engineering, and sustainability. And we caught up with him in Portland, Oregon. And so the first thing we discussed was what it was about biochar that captivated him so much 15 years ago.
It was such an obvious and elegant, holistic solution to a waste management problem that also creates electricity, energy, sequesters carbon. It just made a lot of sense to me the first time I heard it and continued to make more sense every time I thought through it. So it really just is this incredibly elegant solution that makes sense on multiple levels. So I think that's what keeps bringing me back to the biochar concept is just the multiple levels of technology.
In other aspects of the sustainability world, people talk about like value stacking. And if you stack all these values together, then it pencils out. And I kind of see like you saw biochar as having all these different values as well, just inherently, right? Not needing to bring them all together to make something pencil, like it just naturally pencils out in itself. So let's break it down first. What is biochar? And then what are all these different attributes that you see for different applications?
First off, I'll just tell you, it's confusing what biochar is because it's both a material and it's a technology. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but we are kind of stuck with that nomenclature. It's developed enough kind of brand recognition that, that's what how people talk about this technology and this material. So the material is a whole lot like charcoal. It's essentially looks and feels like charcoal. At least wood biochar does. The major difference is that charcoal is used to heat your grill, or in some cases, like heat something else. Biochar is used for things where you're not burning. So it's used as a soil amendment to hold water, to hold nutrients, to improve crop yields. It's used as an additive to concrete to reduce the amount of cement you need. It's used in potting media. It's used in stormwater filtration. So it's essentially a whole lot like charcoal, but you use it for a bunch of different things that have other benefits. And so that's the material. Now, the process is essentially the idea that you're taking waste biomass, so think sawdust or bark or rice hulls, almond shells, peach pits, whatever, any sort of pile of waste biomass, and there's a lot of it around. And you heat that material without oxygen around. So if you were to heat up a piece of wood out in a fire, it's going to burn because there's oxygen around. But without oxygen, it can't burn. So what happens is these vapors come out of it, and you kind of pull those vapors aside and make electricity with it. You burn those vapors because they're combustible. And what's left over is charcoal. And that's how charcoal is made. Essentially, if you heat any biomass, but think about wood. Wood's the easiest thing to think about. If you heat it without oxygen around, that's how you make charcoal. So what you're left with is charcoal, and essentially the whole process is a way to make electricity or heat and sequester carbon, and you're left with this product that has other benefits. So it's really three pieces of the technology, and those are kind of the three different values: is energy production, carbon sequestration, and making these valuable products or improving soil quality, things like that.
But people couldn't just go get a bag of charcoal and throw it in the ground and attempt to get the same benefits in the soil, right? These are completely different materials.
They are a little different for sure. Charcoal is made at a lower temperature, so it can have a little bit more impurities in there. So when they make charcoal, what they're trying to do is they're trying to maximize the amount of heating in your little piece of charcoal. So it tends to be made at a lower production temperature. Biochar is cooked at a temperature of about 500 degrees Celsius, or I guess that's like 900 Fahrenheit. Charcoal is made typically a couple hundred degrees lower. And it does mean that charcoal, you wouldn't want to put it in your garden because it can have some impurities in there and some tars and oils that aren't left at the higher temperatures.
Because those are burned off, I would assume, or something like that at the higher temperature.
Exactly. They get burned off, they evaporate, and then they're not in the material anymore.
So then what are some of the misconceptions around using biochar in the field? You know, we're all just sort of getting our heads around it, if you will. And I can sense how some people might have some misunderstandings about how to use it.
There are a bunch, and I'll just start with the fact that what's interesting about this technology is that you might already know this, but biochar was discovered in some ways only about like 30 or 40 years ago by some soil scientists who sort of discovered biochar in the Amazon. And they realized that ancient Amazonian people were using biochar to create better soil. They were improving the soil by essentially creating biochar on purpose and blending it in with their soil. And actually, there's these vast areas of the Amazon. I think it's like 5 to 10% of the area of the Amazon. Most of the Amazonian soil is this red clay where you could hardly grow anything. It's like notoriously poor soil for growing crops. It grows huge rainforests, but it you can't really grow crops with it. So there are these black earth soils. They call them the terra preta de Indio, the black earth of the Indians, which were discovered sort of right by modern scientists, I guess, because the technology was lost. And actually, they found that native peoples all over the world were actually doing this. Well, it's not confined to the Amazon. It was just originally discovered there. But native peoples all around the world were using charcoal to intentionally improve soil. And it's also true that it's a natural part of all of our soils all around the world. Anywhere where there's fire in the ecosystem, there is black carbon in the soil, and it dramatically improves soil quality, soil health, productivity. Right? It's a part of all the soils all over the world. That's kind of just the starting point. But in terms of like one of the misconceptions is just that the application is really easy right now, and I'll just be perfectly honest. The technology is really in redevelopment today, right? We're working on redeveloping the technology to use this stuff. And I think there are other ones too. Another one that I see pretty often is the idea that you can just sprinkle some biochar in your field and it will instantly improve things. And we like to work with farmers as much as possible at our organization, really to make sure that what's happening is that you're getting farmers to actually be engaged in the process of designing the approach to using the product. We see this pretty big disconnect, especially in the research world, where sometimes researchers are just sort of like sprinkling biochar on top. And sometimes they see a result and sometimes they don't. But in the real world, farmers don't just sprinkle things on, right? Farmers are highly sensitive to whether or not it's going to fit within their practices, whether or not it's going to make them money, right? Like farmers have very small margins. Every farmer does, pretty much. So really trying to like make sure that the technology and the approaches are really designed in a way that is beneficial to farmers.
How would you recommend that farmers use biochar on their fields? What's the best practice?
For row crops, what we often see is using something called a lime spreader. So agricultural lime is a common product. So you can typically use a lime spreader to spread lime. So talking about row crops like corn or potatoes, right? So you would use a lime spreader. You always want to make sure that biochar isn't totally dry. And as long as there's a little bit of moisture in it, it won't create a dust cloud. So you typically want to use that lime spreader. You spread it and then you till it in, pretty quickly after you spread it, because if it's a windy day, for instance, biochar is a really lightweight material. So that's how you would do it in like a row crop. But we're seeing a lot of people in the vineyard space too. And in the vineyards, it's pretty different. So they're doing something called deep ripping, where they're like ripping out a trench, which is common practice in vineyards. That's how they plant a vineyard. They actually kind of rip a pretty deep trench, a couple feet deep. And so they're ripping it and putting the biochar and blending it in with compost and with the soil in that trench, and then planting the grapes on top. So it really does depend on the cropping system. And it really depends also because every different type of cropping system, the farmers are using different equipment. So really comes down to matching the application approach to what farmers are already doing.
And the carbon sequestration is coming from the fact that you're taking this biomass and turning it into biochar.
Yeah, well, so the carbon sequestration is, in a lot of ways, what's really happening is the plants are pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So, right, I mean, every day plants that's what they do. That's their job, is use photosynthesis to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And biochar right now is only ever allowed to be made from waste biomass. And even beyond that, the economics wouldn't ever really work to make it from purpose-grown biomass. one thing I like to say is a nice log is worth a whole lot of money as lumber, and it's not worth nearly as much money as a wood chip for biochar. So it's always made from waste material, and and in that regard, the plant has captured that carbon, and biochar is sort of a storage mechanism. So once you've converted that into biochar, it lasts for typically over 1,000 years. Estimates are hard to come by. It's kind of hard to know exactly how long biochar lasts. Does it last for 800 or 1,000 or 1,200? Like, there aren't any studies that have looked at the length, that kind of length of time, right? The longest studies we have are 20 years, but they generally show close to zero degradation of the stable part of that biochar. So that's essentially the storage mechanism. Biochar also does sort of improve soil health. It helps plants grow more. So it has other benefits that add additional soil carbon. But really the storage, the sequestration piece is like converting that waste piece of wood that otherwise would get eaten up by microbes in a couple of years. You're converting that into a stable form of carbon.
And then how are the plants benefiting from it? How's the soil benefiting from it once it's in the ground?
I typically think of biochar as a sponge in the soil. And actually what's really cool is if you look at like electron microscope images of biochar, I highly recommend you go check them out. They're great. They're like these crazy honeycombs. A piece of wood will be the vascular structure of the cell walls is preserved in this really cool matrix. So it's a super porous material. And so essentially I think of it as a sponge. Water and nutrients are held in that material. So it's not really a fertilizer. What it really does is help plants better use the water that's available and better use the nutrients that are available. So it holds them better. And of course, that makes that water and nutrients available for longer, and then plants are more able to get them. One crazy thing about agriculture in general, only about half of the fertilizer that gets applied, particularly for nitrogen, which is the most important fertilizer out there, only half the nitrogen that gets applied in the world ends up in the plants we eat. The other half of it either turns into atmospheric gases or it ends up getting washed out of the soil into lakes and rivers where it ends up as pollution. So that's really how biochar is mostly benefiting the soil, is just holding those nutrients for longer to help increase the amount that plants are able to grab.
It sounds like you still might use some fertilizer or, like you said, compost, organic nutrients adding to the soil, and then the biochar. I like that analogy of acting like a sponge and holding some of this stuff in for longer so that the plants can take advantage of it.
Yeah, and you're still using fertilizer, but you can use less. That's kind of the point, is that you can use less fertilizer and still get the same yield.
And from a business model perspective, we've seen biochar become available as carbon removal credits. And companies like Microsoft and Google have made some big announcements recently where they've bought some of these credits. And so, can you walk us through that aspect of it? And I was so happy to see these announcements because I remember at one point Bill Gates said something like, we shouldn't be planting all these trees. Like, we really should just focus on industrial carbon sequestration because we can measure it and we can control it. And I remember being really upset with him about that because I'm like, what do you mean we should be planting trees? That's crazy. Just because you have an investment over here doesn't mean, right? But anyway, I digress. They've made these investments and they've added some credibility to the industry, which I really appreciate. But how are these carbon removal credits going to work?
In some ways, what companies like Microsoft are wanting, and Microsoft has done incredible work in this space. So just hats off to the team at Microsoft for persevering and making the type of commitments they've made. They've made some enormous commitments to offset all their historic, current, and future emissions, which is just stunning to suggest they're going to offset all their historic emissions. So what they're looking for, I think, in the carbon credit space, one of the challenges of carbon credits is I need to be able to say to you, if I want to buy a carbon credit from you, I need to be able to say, oh, Lisa Ann changed her behavior because I paid her this money to change her behavior to not drive today or something, right? Whatever the carbon credit you want to sell is. So I think the reason why companies like Microsoft have started shying away a little bit around the forestry-based stuff, it's hard to prove that you not cutting down this group of trees means that there's actually any change in the amount of trees out there. Unless we stop building so many houses, I'm not sure the amount of trees changes, right? Whether or not we cut down this piece of land or that piece of land. So I think in terms of carbon credits, trees become a little challenging, which is why companies like Microsoft and Google have really been pivoting to these engineered solutions. Oftentimes they'll call them durable engineered removals. And what's happened in that space, so some of the other technologies in that space are things like direct air capture, right? Like running these giant fans to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and pump it underground, or enhanced rock weathering, where you're kind of grinding up certain types of rock and spreading it on fields, and that absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. Those companies and those organizations have done a really great job, I think, of convincing people in companies like Microsoft that they need to be doing these durable removals. But what they haven't done very well is deliver an affordable solution. And so, at the end of the day, companies are looking to biochar because it's shovel ready. Like biochar is at a high level of technological readiness. You can build facilities. There's dozens of them operating around the world, industrial scale, smaller scale, artisanal scale. Like at every scale, there's hundreds of facilities around the world operating today. So they can buy these credits now. And it's also just so much cheaper than a lot of these other technologies because first off, it's been deployed. So it's, as I said, it's shovel ready. So that obviously is driving it further down the cost curve. But there's also some of these co-benefits. So we're able to, companies are able to sell the biochar, like the physical biochar, and they're actually selling that separately than they're selling the carbon credit. So they're selling the physical product to a farmer, and they're selling a carbon credit to a company like Microsoft. So they're able to offset some of that cost of the carbon credit by also selling a physical product that has value. So that just is what it comes down to is cost at this point. And everything I've seen is biochar is likely to lead the way on delivering these carbon credits for at least the next decade.
And the carbon credit industry has had some real challenges in the past with, like you said, credibility. And we'll put some links in our show notes to some shows where we've done more of an exploration around that for you listeners. So let's get into some standards. Okay. So we've got these carbon removal credits, but obviously we need some standards to make sure that everything is there's some equality across these different solutions. So there's the NRCS code 336 soil carbon amendment. What is that, and how is the industry adopting it?
Yeah, so NRCS is a part of United States Department of Agriculture. So NRCS is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And NRCS, the real goal of that organization is to help American farmers essentially reduce their environmental impact. And they've been around for, I think since the 30s. And they generally provide cost share incentives to farmers to help them improve their environmental practices. And one of the things that farmers can get paid for right now is to use biochar as a soil amendment, particularly in sandy soil. That's where we're seeing a lot of the movement here, because as I said, biochar is kind of like a sponge, and sandy soil is the kind of soil that really needs some sponges. So that's where we're seeing it most often deployed. And we do a lot of work to honestly help educate NRCS staff themselves, because it's kind of a new technology within NRCS. So we actually do a lot of work to try and make sure that NRCS staff understand how they can use the program that they have on the books. And really, it's a huge opportunity in the United States for farmers to get low-cost biochar to help them start experimenting of how best to use it.
And then you also have a couple of different states with different types of standards or requirements for the type of biochar that would be used on land in their jurisdictions. So, what are the differences between some of these requirements?
Yeah, a lot of them are coming down at this point, and this is something we do a lot of work on as an organization at USBI. A lot of it has to do with making sure the biochar that gets deployed, that we don't create an environmental problem while trying to solve another one. This story, many of us have seen this movie before, where you try and solve one problem and you create another.
Frogs in Australia?
Yes, frogs in Australia. So, there are ways, if you make biochar the wrong way, or if you make from the wrong material, you can end up with a product that could create some environmental pollution, right, in fields. And we don't want to spread biochar across fields and then realize 20 years later that we contaminated things. So a lot of these standards, and we're working on this standard now, is to really make sure that we first off are able to determine if there are pollutants in the material. It's kind of a new material, so even like figuring out how to analyze this in a commercial lab is challenging. And then once you can identify those potential pollutants, making sure that we don't allow anything with those pollutants in it to be sold as biochar to generate a carbon credit. And I would say on the whole, very little biochar has pollutants. Some of the pollutants there can be are, you can't have heavy metals. All biochar has a small amount of heavy metals, but a lot of heavy metals, honestly, are also plant nutrients, right? Copper is a good example. Copper is an essential plant nutrient, but it's also a potential heavy metal pollutant. Just kind of depends on the amount that you're deploying. So heavy metals are one category. We also pay attention to PFAS, right? This forever chemical that is in a lot of stuff, including some materials that are used to make biochar. It's in all of our bodies. It's in the compost stack, right? Like it's ubiquitous. And then other kind of legacy pollutants like PCBs. But if you make biochar correctly, there's very little of any of those in it. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to make sure that we don't create any environmental problems when we're trying to solve a climate problem.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell our listeners that we also have a PFAS episode, so I'm going to put that in our show notes as well for you all to listen if you want to learn more. And so thank you for mentioning some of the work that you do with the US Biochar Initiative. You're not-for-profit company and you're advocating for biochar. So like what does that actually mean?
We focus on increasing production and use of biochar in the United States. And, it's a pretty broad topic. So what we really focus on are kind of three things. First off, we develop standards for biochar to make sure that the technology is deployed in a safe and effective way, and that we can compare between different types of biochar. So that's one thing, is standards. The other thing we focus most of our time on is developing end-use markets for the physical product. So there's carbon removal credits. We do that a little bit. We engage in that a little bit, but we're mostly focused on who's going to use the biochar and what are they going to use it for. And so we work with biochar companies, and we work with a lot of end users, small farmers, government organizations, large corporations. Like, we work across the board to help people understand what biochar is, how to use it, and we work with people to help them implement trials. And the final thing we do is we host an annual conference, and that's kind of our big event of the year. We host the biggest biochar conference in North America, and the next one is coming up in September in Minneapolis, the 15th to 18th. So anybody who's interested in learning more about biochar, it's a great place to be.
The city of Minneapolis recently launched a city-owned biochar facility. Can you tell us a little bit about what Minneapolis is doing and how you'd like to see this emulated elsewhere?
Yeah, definitely. The city of Minneapolis is doing a really cool project. They're opening up a municipal biochar production facility that's going to primarily take waste wood from the city. And at a high level, you think, okay, where's all the waste biomass in the world? And a city is not typically where you would think it would be. And at a high level, it's true. Like, most of the waste biomass is in rural areas, it's in farmland, it's in timberland. But uh, cities, particularly like in the rainier parts of the U.S., have all these trees, and people love trees. I love trees. I have lots of trees. But eventually trees die, or their limbs break, or there's an ice storm or something, right? And there's an enormous amount of tree waste in cities. And one of the things that's also true in cities, as opposed to like out in timberland where there's like forestry companies, there's no market for a dying branch from an oak tree, right? No timber, no like lumber company is going to say, yeah, we're going to turn that into a great piece of lumber. It just gets chipped up. Some of it's used by homeowners, but a lot of it ends up going to a landfill. A lot of these companies actually have to pay to get rid of this stuff. So in most cases, it's free material to make a biochar facility. So that's kind of the starting point. Is there's a lot of biomass out there, and there's also a lot of uses for biochar in cities. You can use it in stormwater management, in urban gardens, in concrete, in potting media. And the last thing I'll say is it's a really cool opportunity too, because there's a bunch of cities around the country that are really trying to take the lead on climate policy, particularly, in the current administration, right? Trying to sort of push the envelope and kind of take some of the lead on climate, including where I live. I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have all sorts of climate policies. This represents a really tangible way that cities can actually make a measurable, tangible impact because cities don't have as many levers as you might think they do. You can focus on things like land use, solar panels, and those are important and good. But this is one where a city can really say, okay, we're going to operate or subsidize some sort of public-private partnership to open a biochar facility to manage our tree waste. So it's a really great project, and we're really hoping that it's successful and other cities copy it.
Okay, so you mentioned stormwater treatment, and my brain was like, "What? How does that work?" So, how would you use biochar in that application?
So I'm going to distill this down because this is near and dear to my heart. I spent about 8 years before I was in the biochar sector full time. I spent about 8 years as a stormwater engineer working with biochar and with other things too. So in the stormwater world, there's a lot of movement towards something called stormwater green infrastructure, which essentially is the idea of using plants and soil to treat and manage stormwater runoff instead of always just using pipes. So some of the technologies that you and your listeners might be aware of are things like rain gardens that infiltrate stormwater runoff, or green roofs that slow down that sort of pulse of heavy rain, or stormwater ponds that also kind of reduce flooding. So more and more people are moving towards stormwater green infrastructure, and biochar can be used in a couple ways. It's almost a tailor-made solution for stormwater green infrastructure. It does essentially three things. First off, it removes pollutants. As I said, it's kind of like this crazy sponge. It's a lot like something called activated carbon. So it removes pollutants. It removes heavy metals, nutrients, PFAS, right? So it can sorb a lot of these pollutants as long as you filter water through it. And that's what you're doing. You're putting it in these bioretention systems or rain gardens. So it removes pollutants. It can also help increase the infiltration of the underlying soil. So that's a big part of what these systems, these green infrastructure systems, are doing. Is they're helping to manage runoff by getting it to infiltrate into the ground. And one of the things that's happened as we've urbanized is we've covered the world in concrete and roofs. And so it increases flooding, but it's also reducing the amount of water that gets back to our groundwater aquifers. So if you can increase that infiltration, you reduce flooding and you increase groundwater recharge. And then the final thing is biochar helps plants grow. And so you can imagine these vegetated systems, the plants play an important role. And they're also a big part of the cost of maintaining these systems are when plants die. So all over the country, the biggest cost of green infrastructure in the stormwater space is plant death. Plants die in these systems because in some ways they're sort of plant torture facilities. They're wet during storms and then they're super dry in between.
Those poor plants.
There's four plants. There's a very select set of plants that can deal with those conditions. It's funny, they're the same plants everywhere because they're the only plants that can really deal with that kind of horrible conditions. It's the juncuses are the survivors. So by helping the plants survive, it reduces the maintenance costs and helps these systems perform better.
We're also going to be doing an interview in the future around seed vaults and living libraries, and how geneticists are discovering the DNA of certain plant attributes that thrived during certain conditions, whether it be drought or heavy rain, and then trying to bring those into a modern plant to make them more climate resistant.
Yeah, I see that a lot here with right now we have a forest right out back of my house. The increasing temperature year after year, these maple trees are just suffering. They're dying left and right.
We've talked a lot about sort of the market in terms of carbon removal credits, but we really haven't talked about the demand from farmers. What's happening right now around adoption of this solution, literally at the ground level? What's the reaction from farmers?
I would say pretty mixed right now. So there are some types of farmers that are really where there's pretty solid uptake and increasing uptake, and then there's other farmers that I think are pretty resistant. And I think partially it comes down to really targeting those farmers and farmer types that are more open to using biochar. So, just an example is like vineyards. There's been a lot of success in using biochar in vineyards along the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. And vineyard growers are pretty experimental people. They often are are trying different techniques. They're trying different amendments. They also typically have higher profit margins because they're growing like a specialty crop, so they can experiment a little bit more. So there's been a lot of uptake there, and a lot of those farmers are using biochar without incentives. In other cropping systems, it's been much more of an uphill battle in things like large row crops, but we're really leveraging that NRCS 336 program, right? Those federal cost share incentives are really important to helping some of these bigger acreage farmers in kind of the more commodity cropping systems to have the ability to be a little more flexible. Corn and soybean growers in the Midwest, their margins are really, really, really thin, and it's a very dialed in system. So they don't have a lot of financial flexibility to try it unless there are incentives out there. And then, of course, the final group where we're seeing really strong uptake is smaller scale and organic farmers. There's a lot of interest in those farms and, increasing uptake in those farms. And that's really great to see. It's also true, though, that like to really have biochar scale as a climate solution, we need to be able to get, much more than the organic acreage. The organic acreage is a solid start for the industry, but it's got to go more mainstream than that if we want to have like an appreciable, climate impact.
I get a sense that we're in that early adoption curve right now.
Absolutely.
The people who are open to new ideas, trying new things, taking a risk, being forward thinking. And then as they prove that this works, their peers will take notice, and then you'll get more adoption over time. I'm not surprised that the vineyards are on that early adoption curve, because I've heard that vineyards are some of the highest climate risk agricultural practices out there, pretty much because you spend so much time, years, decades, growing these vines, and it's not like you can just move them somewhere else. And then the terroir of that land is so indicative and instrumental to the flavor of the wine that you're producing that people have enjoyed for so long, that you can't just like move somewhere else and grow the same product.
I have a good family friend who swears that California wine just keeps getting worse, but nobody knows anymore because nobody's around long enough to remember what it used to taste like when every year wasn't hot. And it is true. It's like these vineyards it's hot every year. There's a lot of wine all along, all across the country, but especially in California, like it's hot every year.
So the biochar is helping them to retain more water and nutrients into the soil. And in theory, that's going to help the grapes grow better. But you know what, though? Also, some of the best vintages of wine are years where they're where the conditions weren't perfect for the grapes, and so they ended up growing in a different way, and that added extra flavor to the wine.
It absolutely can. And I don't understand all the complexity of it. I'm not sure really all that many people do, but wine's viticulture is a really mysterious space. It's one of the probably the strangest agricultural crop out there because some wine growers actually you say, "Oh, biochar might increase your yield," and they say, "Well, our contract doesn't allow us to increase our yield because it's assumed that quality goes down as yield goes up." So some of like the best winemakers will only buy grapes from vineyards that intentionally have low yield because it's assumed that the quality goes down if the vines grow too many grapes. So it's like totally opposite every other crop. Every other crop, a farmer's like, yes, I want to grow more yield. But in the wine world, it's like, no, we can't grow anymore. We don't want that. It's pretty funny.
So we're a futurology podcast. So looking to the future, where do you see biochar evolving in, say, the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think we can expect?
I think a lot of the focus will be really on using biochar to process a lot of the real wastes out there. So, I mentioned already that biochar is only made from like true, waste biomass, but there's a pretty big range of what waste is. So what we're really seeing is a lot of movement in those spaces where you've got something that's so much of a waste that you have to pay to get rid of it today. So like those urban tree waste, right? People are paying to get rid of it. People are paying to get rid of different types of manure, and you can turn that into biochar. People are paying to get rid of certain types of like construction debris. And so there's all these opportunities where you can take this stuff that currently you're having to pay to get rid of. And the economics of these projects just get so much better if you can get somebody to pay you to take their biomass from them. So that's where we're seeing a lot of movement. And then on the youth side, we focus a lot on a couple things: getting more biochar into potting media like horticultural substrate, getting more biochar into concrete, which is a growing use, and also trying to get concrete into the fertilizer market by making these enhanced efficiency fertilizers. I talked about how most nitrogen doesn't make it into the plant. There's ways to use biochar to actually coat biochar on the outside of a fertilizer pellet to make it so that it improves the uptake of nitrogen. So that's really where sort of the technology side is I think going in the next sort of 10 years or so. But I'm always an optimist about scaling biochar. I think there are so many opportunities. It's not going to work everywhere, but it'll work in enough places to have a meaningful impact on our climate, I think.
Over the years, we're just gonna see more and more success stories of biochar in action, and that's going to encourage others, to try it out for themselves. The agricultural industry on the outside seems like it's really slow to adopt new things, and there's a lot of reasons for that, both economic and social, and psychological, but also too, you're at the mercy of the time of nature. Like, if you're gonna run a pilot, you gotta run it for a whole year, maybe 2 years to see if it gets you a result you're looking for. Not like you can just, run it in a lab and simulate something. You really wanna just try it out, for real in the field, and that takes time.
Yeah, and it's also true. Sometimes we see the best results for biochar in the worst years, meaning like some of that water holding benefit. You might not see it in a really wet year, right? Like in a year where there's plenty of rain, you might see no difference between your spot where you used biochar and where you didn't. You're only going to see it in a drought year. And that's really where the benefit, and what's also interesting is in the drought year, if you get higher yield in the drought year, typically the prices for the product you're producing in a drought year go up, right? The price per unit goes up. So like that's where the real benefit is in a lot of the drought mitigation benefit of biochar is increasing yield during the driest years. And you can't design a trial just during dry years. Like you got to just wait. So it's a challenge.
Earthlings. If you happen to be near the Minneapolis area in the coming weeks or have the ability to get yourself there, go on over to the North American Biochar Conference. That's being put on by USBI, and Miles will be there. You can talk to him in person. It's taking place in September from the 15th to the 18th, and you can click on the links in the show notes to learn more. And as I reflect on this conversation, it reminds me of how much more value we tend to put on high tech silver bullets for any solution, really, be it carbon removal or something else. And I think it's because as humans, we tend to be more self centered with regards to things that we create ourselves. Like, it has to be better than nature's solution because we're way smarter than nature. Well, yeah, right. Nature's got a lot on us, to be sure. And biochar is just another on that growing list of solutions that has its roots both in nature as well as well established practices of native people long before it was quote unquote discovered by the white man. So I feel like sooner or later we're going to start realizing and accepting that sometimes progress isn't about inventing something new, but remembering and returning to those solutions that already work. And we know they already work. We just get a chance to, you know, take a simpler route. And I think if we did that a little bit more, we might all be better off. So the next time you hear about carbon removal, I invite you to look beyond the futuristic renderings and consider the power of regenerative practices, these things that have been around longer than any of us. And, maybe if we do this right, you know, they'll be here long after we're gone, quietly healing the damage that we've left behind. Speaking of quiet solutions that make a difference, our faith in humanity is restored this week by Shubhendu Shamra, a former Toyota engineer that turned urban forester in India. While working at Toyota, he met a Japanese botanist named Akira Miyawaki. And Akira is the creator of the Miyawaki method. Shocking. What that does is it involves planting native tree species close together to simulate a natural forest and promoting quick growth and biodiversity. This fascinated him, and so he applied this method to his backyard, which resulted in a thriving mini forest in just a few years. And Sharma was so inspired by the experience that he left his job to dedicate himself to restoring native ecosystems. He went on to found A Forest, which is an organization that helps ordinary people grow dense, biodiverse forests in the most unexpected places, like a schoolyard or a factory lot or a backyard. And he uses the Miyawaki method, and his team is now growing trees 10 times faster than conventional reforestation, and they're becoming self sustaining within a few years. And I am willing to bet part of that success has to do with that density allowing for the mycelial network to thrive and provide nutrients across the mini forest. I'm just speculating here, but if you've listened to any of our other episodes related to mycelium, you would understand where I'm coming from. So, A Forest has helped communities across the globe plant over 130 forests in more than 10 countries. And they're creating these lush oases that cool cities, deliver clean air, and give wildlife a place to return to. So, to Sharma and everyone transforming empty spaces into living ecosystems, thank you for reminding us what's possible on this beautiful blue-green space flower that we call home.